up to folks who are engaged via chat and who have some questions or some thoughts or some perspectives that everybody really needs to hear, and we'll invite you to come onto the screen with us, and then you'll be able to share that video if you want to. Sometimes we've had some people on here who are not video ready, but they've still got some thoughts to contribute, and that's totally fine wherever you're at. And then we'll have a conversation, and we'll bring you on, and then we'll talk to you for a minute, and then we'll scoot you back out and bring some other folks on so that we can have a fully participatory discussion. So you can put thoughts and things in chat. We encourage you to connect with folks in chat. Like, this is an opportunity to be able to do some organizing and get people's contact information, follow up with folks if that's what you feel like you really want to do. And then there's also a way that you can send questions specifically to the panelists without actually putting them in chat. If you've got something that you want to kind of bypass for whatever reason, I don't know, use all the avenues that you want to, but welcome to the space, and we hope that you are going to be having a great time as we are.
Thank you for that introduction, Nakia. And I just want to say that we are now live streaming on all the platforms, on Facebook and on YouTube. So contribute your comments. We invite participation. Yeah. And if you're on Facebook watching us, there's plenty of space in this Zoom conference room if you want to come in and join us here.
Yeah, welcome. So we're just going to start right off. JP and I are going to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what it is about their particular lens that makes it useful for this conversation on policing in schools. And then we'll talk a little bit more about like what their framework is around, like, what are they thinking about when they think of that intersection, right? So my name is Nakia Winfield. If y'all have come to this before, you have seen me. I am a political social worker, and I also do systems analysis, power analysis, systems accountability, using an interdisciplinary lens to look at power dynamics and social systems. For the last couple of years, I have been trying to get some form of police accountability through various different ways, especially with the lens of anti-racism. That's been up and down. You all see how our policing is right now, so we can talk about that a little bit later. But I'm excited to be in this conversation with y'all. JP, do you want to tell them a little bit about what you do and what your lens is?
Yeah, my name is João Paulo. I'm known as JP. I am a community organizer and a local troublemaker with the Austin Justice Coalition. At AJC, I focus on housing and community development. That's my main area, but you know, police and public safety questions were what really motivated me to get into this work to begin with. I am a abolitionist. That for me, that means I believe that we can one day achieve this world without police and without prisons, and it's not just an imaginary space. But I think to get there, we have to first allow ourselves to think of new possibilities, think of new ways of doing things. And that's why I love these conversations so much, because they're this perfect opportunity for us to allow ourselves to kind of expand our horizons around some of these questions and just think beyond what we've been given. So I'm excited and looking forward to having this conversation with y'all.
Dr. Robinson, you want to tell us a little bit about where you've been, what your experience is?
Hi, everybody. Thank you, AJC, for inviting me today to this really wonderful, important conversation. Courtney Robinson, and I am the founder and CEO of the Excellence and Advancement Foundation. Our mission, we're just dedicated to transforming how communities combat the school to prison pipeline. So for me, I come to this work as someone whose father was incarcerated when I was 6 months old, spent 10 years locked up. He was 18 at the time when he was incarcerated, 17 at the time that he committed the crime. I've spent really the majority of my adult life working with youth who have found themselves entangled in the school discipline and criminal justice systems. I started the organization because I realized that kids need more, and they need someone who is really speaking for them and to them. And so this issue around policing is critically important, because I believe if we must have police, they need to police outside of the school buildings.
Thank you so much. I don't, can you let me know how to pronounce your last name?
Yeah, so my name is Jemima Abalogo. I am the Youth Justice Ambassador with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition. And there we really work to end mass incarceration and really work for meaningful prison and criminal justice reforms. So my role there mainly as the Youth Justice Ambassador is really working in schools and with youth around kind of Texas, and seemingly in the past couple of weeks, it's been really around the nation as we have this kind of larger discussion of, do police belong in our schools, or can we imagine a world without police? So my main focus and my main lens is really talking about alternatives and speaking up for students my age. I am 17 years old and I'm a very fresh graduate from high school myself, and I'm an incoming freshman at Loyola University Chicago, where I hope to study political science and sociology. But basically, I come with a lot of experience of what school is like today in 2020 for the past however many years I've been in the public school system. So I come as an advocate for my peers, other students, and really letting youth know that they can be in these rooms and that they need to be at the center of these conversations, because they are the ones who walk into the school buildings every day and face those police or sheriffs in their school buildings.
Thank you so much. So when you all talk about, or when you think about the intersection between schools and policing, what are the parts that make up your framework? How do you think about those things? What comes up for you?
I think for me, what comes up is that it hasn't always been this way. And I think that we've pretended like it has always been this way. When we just think about Texas, for instance, Brown v. Board was 1954. Texas was forced to integrate in 1968. And then in 1969 is when the legislature created a law and order policy that combined our schools and our juvenile justice systems. And that's when we started to slowly see police officers come into our spaces. And then, of course, with zero tolerance policies, that just ramped it up tremendously because we had so much funding and sort of all of these things sort of coming towards the schools to fund more police. But what we know and what we see is that there are schools in every city that don't have police, and they're doing just fine. There are schools right here in Austin. Let's take LBJ and LASA. Downstairs at LBJ, there are armed police officers. Upstairs for LASA, there are nicely dressed security guards. Who we police, how we police looks very, very different. And what I know for sure is that when police officers are in the building, we have more arrest, even though juvenile crime is down. The combination of police and school just screams school to prison pipeline.
I think for me, really, the biggest thing that shaped my framework and my lens when talking about this issue is the difference between a safe school and a safe student. So in kind of my ideal world, those two things should be synonymous. Having a safe school means having a place where a student feels safe, they feel like they can access the resources that they need, that they can get mental health resources, that it's a safe place for them to learn, to express themselves, to grow, to be fully themselves in their identity and in their adolescence. However, we've seen over the past couple of years, and especially after Columbine, kind of the rise in this SRO, or the school resource officer, who is touted as this kind of catch-all of someone who can be a coach, a mentor, a teacher, a counselor, when really they are a police officer with less training, when the police officers who are on our streets already barely have enough training as it is, which is also very concerning. But The difference is when we talk about safe schools, we've turned schools into these like fortresses where no one can come in and out. Everyone needs to have an ID. It's very heavily policed. And to an extent, I mean, we can all understand the reasoning behind that. We can all understand that that is quote unquote to stop these intruders coming into our schools and harming our kids. That is the reasoning that we are often being sold. But that's just not the reality of what's happening in our schools. We know that school resource officers aren't protecting kids, they're policing kids and assaulting kids. A lot of times they're not arresting people who are coming in off campus with intent to harm kids. They're arresting kids with trauma. They're arresting kids that are quote unquote problem kids, kids who come from backgrounds where they need extra support, where they need extra help because they're facing abuse at home, they're facing poverty, they're facing issues that go beyond the school day. And when they come to school, they're carrying that with us because we have to understand the students, when we walk into the classroom, we're not leaving our life behind. Teenagers just don't have, I know that I didn't have the ability to just drop my baggage off outside my algebra classroom and sit down and just like think about math. That's not how we work. We're emotional creatures. So we need to start thinking about how we've created this image of what a safe school looks like. And that doesn't have to be locked doors, armed security guards walking down our halls, drug dogs sniffing lockers, things like that, because we know, we've seen over the past years with the rise in school shootings that school resource officers aren't helping. We saw, I can't remember the exact case, but I know it was ruled in court that, I think it was in the Parkland shooting, I may be wrong. If someone knows what I'm talking about, please put it in the chat and check me if I'm wrong, that a school resource officer actually ran away from a school shooting. And he said in court, it's not my job. That is not what I'm here for. And it's not actually my job to protect these kids. So it's like, what are you here to do? What is that? Where are those resources that you're toting as an officer? But we know that they're actually there to over police and arrest and funnel kids into the school to prison pipeline. And we know that that is disproportionately affecting Black kids, kids of color, and disabled kids.
Oh, there's a lot of incredible stuff there to unpack, and there's so much there. That's fantastic. I think we started off very powerfully there. And Dr. Robinson, I really wanted to ask you, you mentioned the school to prison pipeline, and I was wondering if you could sort of sketch that out for us. What happens in that pipeline? You know, what is the process through which a student ends up on the other end of that? Yeah, I'm just, if you could help us sort of visualize that.
I mean, I think Jima kind of laid it out beautifully of what happens in our schools. I have an organization for you to run when you finish college, but that's another conversation. So what we're really talking about is some really complex factors in terms of, we have shadow discipline, we have what we call mandatory referrals, and we have discretionary referrals. With the mandatory referrals, that's weapons and drugs. Now, those referrals make up about 3% of the referrals in our schools. The rest are all discretionary. And discretionary with Black children looks like talking back, insubordination, disrupting assembly. With children who are not Black or brown, that could be tobacco, drugs, or weapons, or assault on a teacher in our schools. So it's a very different sort of paradigm. But what happens is that in preschool, Black girls, Black boys, some brown girls, some brown boys start to get these sort of discretionary, disciplinary things that happen. They miss recess. They have to sit in a special place in the classroom. They get sent out of the classroom. And that sort of escalates. So we sort of set up this paradigm for children where once they have one disciplinary action, they are guaranteed to have another one. We sort of set it up to make them believe that they are a particular kind of child. So by the time they get to the end of middle school, we have a string of disciplinary referrals. They don't want to go to school anymore because school is no longer fun. It's not engaging. It doesn't belong to them. And so then we start to see truancy. Truancy, then they're going to court. Now they're in court. And while you're in court, the court potentially can threaten you with going to a higher court and detention. And then all of a sudden, parents and youth find themselves in the juvenile justice system or in the court system, and they're paying fines. And generally, they can't afford the fines that they're paying. And so then they're caught sort of in this like system that they can't find their way out of. And so the school to prison pipeline is just like this progression generally from preschool all the way through high school. Every once in a while, we'll get a family that first incident happens in middle school. I'll give you a prime example. There was a young girl who was being racially bullied at her school. I mean, all throughout the year. The mom, the student was going to the counselor, she was going to the principal. She kept telling people over and over again, like how she was being bullied. The school didn't do anything to intervene in this young girl's safety. Towards the end of the school year, the bullies just kept coming at her, and she did what was developmentally appropriate. She punched the girl. And so what then happens? Then she has assault charges, and now she's going to court. And this is a girl who, straight A student, will likely go to Harvard. I mean, she's simply the sweetest, just most brilliant girl. It's that kind of neglect that happens in our school that leads to the school to prison pipeline. So you have the sort of the disciplinary jumps, but then you also have just one incident that changes the student's entire life. So we just don't keep Black kids safe in our schools. Safety for us doesn't mean police. That it doesn't mean the same thing. And police don't treat Black and brown students the same way in our schools. And so that it makes our numbers just go up and up and up, because we're constantly disciplining Black and brown children just for holding space.
That makes me think about like even the students who are not directly, so one, you said so much. So there's a school to prison pipeline, and I think that we talk about it so often in this way that seems like it's almost inevitable, like it's a natural growing thing that like is kind of unstoppable. It's just this thing, and there's not really a way to be able to like, you have to navigate it, right? You have to go around it, like so many other systems of power that are specifically set up to exploit Black and brown kids. But it makes me think of like, there's the kids that are caught in it. And then there are also Black and brown kids that witness others who may not have that one incident, who may be able to like get out unscathed, but like every single day they show up, they know who those police are for, and it's not to protect them, right? Like they know that like they are hailed as the exceptions, but like that's still so much trauma in that space. Or for the kids who are over policed at home, right, who are constantly harassed at home in their own neighborhoods, or who have family members like you who have had family members who have been like taken by police officers, that have been brutalized, maimed, killed by police officers, and then have to come into this building where, again, these police are not there to protect them, right? These police are there in case those kids do anything wrong, or even are just perceived to do something wrong, right? And how much trauma there is there, even without somebody having to go to court. And I can't imagine how much more trauma there is once you were in court as a teenager, right? And in this place of power as somebody who is subject to the bureaucracy and these laws in a way that is meant to subjugate you, right?
Yeah.
And you know, that really kind of also brings up a question, a point where I think about, you know, you mentioned the way that these students are sort of made to go to court, answer before a judge, and there's a whole process of treating these kids as if they were adults, and kids who in other areas do not have the legal rights or roles or responsibilities of adults, but are criminalized and are made to deal with the system as though they were already adults.
And once they're in court, we see huge disparities. I'll just give you one situation. I was in court, and there was a student, a Black student, whose who had some housing struggles with the family, and the family was sort of figuring out their housing situation, and so they were missing school. And on top of that, mom had some illnesses, so that was contributing to the housing struggle that they were in at the time. And the kid told that to the judge, and the judge had that kid essentially in this sort of probationary period for a really long time, months and months and months. A white kid came up and they asked, well, why haven't you been going to school? And the kid said, my dog died and I just haven't really been able to deal with that. And the judge was like, okay, no problem. We understand. We'll keep an eye on this child and we'll just check in with the school. Like, what? Like, watching the disparities happen in front of my eyes is the most troubling thing, I think, is that I have to deal with on a consistent basis. Because it's totally different. We had a young white woman who came to us. She was 16. She probably had enough cocaine and Xanax to supply the entire school, but she was never arrested at school. She was never charged. She went straight to the Alternative Learning Center and spent about 20 days there. We have that happen. We have lesser things happen with Black children, and the punishment is far, far worse than what she received.
And I think one thing I want to emphasize as well as that is that for Black students and many students of color, this is something that they face every day. Like every day walking into school, it's not only when they make a mistake or when they misbehave, it's when they sit down in their classrooms and they're having a discussion and they're told, oh, you're being really aggressive right now. Why are you so loud about this? When another student who's expressing the same passion is labeled as such. They're labeled as passionate. Whereas I remember so many times where I am a passionate person. Obviously, now I'm a youth advocate. That is part of the job. But so many times in school, I was labeled aggressive, loud, angry. So many people, their first impression, they would say, oh, but like, why are you so angry all the time? I'm like, one, I'm passionate. Two, I have so many things to be angry about. So even if I was angry, it's valid. But there's this like system of just constant, like all of these microaggressions that build up where Black and brown kids never get to feel that trust in the system. They never get to trust their teachers fully because they know that they can't relate to the things either that's going on in their community that they have to experience from other students. I know personally, I went to a predominantly white, very wealthy high school. So I did have a lot of privilege in the opportunities that I was allowed to access and things like that. But at the same time, every day when I walked those halls and those sheriffs would look at me, my friends would point it out and say, oh, but look at his drug dog. It's so cute. I wish I could just pet him. But with me, I was always like, I hope I don't walk too close to him. I hope I don't laugh too loud. I hope I don't get into an argument with another student in the hallways, because it's not, oh, that dog is cute. It's, oh, that could be a tool to take my education away from me, to take my future away from me, to take my dreams and separate them from me, because I know if the moment that I'm caught in some sort of infraction or misbehavior, the punishment is 10 times worse for me as a student. And that kind of trauma of having to constantly watch my actions not getting to behave in the same way as all of these students around me who are just kids is deeply unsettling. And it does lead to this adultification where so often I was constantly told, oh, you're so mature. Why? My friends would always joke with me. They're like, oh, you're just an old soul. Like, why do you act like you're 30? And that was a joke that I made a lot of the times too. I was like, oh, I just act like an adult. Like I might as well just be like a 30-year-old woman. When in reality, there are reasons for that. That's because every day when I walked into school, I knew I had to carry myself like an adult because that's how I would get treated. I knew I had to have that maturity because people didn't see the innocence. They didn't see the kid in me. And for me, that was even kind of exacerbated because I'm originally from New Jersey. So I am a year or two younger in my grade. I graduated at 17. I went into school earlier. So I'm even younger than all of my peers, but still being expected to reach this adulthood way, way before all of these students around me. So it's like me having to navigate during this pivotal time in my life. And this was a conversation that I consistently had with kids of color in my school, because though we were few and far between, we existed and we all had that same experience of having to act like adults. And it has very real violent ramifications when kids come into contact with the juvenile justice system. So there are all of these things that when we're talking about police in schools and people are like, oh, but they're just there to keep you safe. It's like, how am I supposed to learn in an environment where I'm not even free to act my age, to be who I am and to fully explore my adolescence? Because those teenage mistakes that everybody else gets to make, that could land me in adult prison very early on in my teenage life.
You know, it seems like one of the very real psychological consequences of having a police presence in schools is that you are forced to perpetually police yourself, and that you just learn to constantly be this kind of self-police officer. And I think that that's very, that's intense.
That was one of those big things. I think when I first started at TCJC, or the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, I sat down with Lindsay Linder, who was kind of my mentor, along with Alicia Castillo, who Lindsay is our senior policy attorney, and Alicia is our youth policy analyst. And I kind of sat down with both of them and I had this conversation with them, and I didn't even realize. And I was just like, yeah, sometimes I'm afraid because like I always speak really loudly and I'm always told that I'm really aggressive, and I never want to come off as aggressive. I just get passionate. I just really care about other people. And Lindsay, I remember, was like, Jemima, you're not aggressive. Like, I've been working with you for like over a year now. I have never once seen you act aggressively towards another person. That's called passion. That's called empathy. You care about other people really deeply and you want to help. That should never be misconstrued as anger. And then I went to school and immediately we had, I think, like a Socratic seminar talking, I think it was just about Hamlet or something really simple in my senior year. My teacher was like, oh, Jemima, take a breath. Like you're acting very aggressive right now. And I immediately clocked it, because in my mind, I constantly have to check, how loud am I speaking? How much passion am I talking with? Am I intimidating other students? When my friends, I ask them about it and they don't have that same self-check because they don't live in the skin that I live in. And they don't have to interact with teachers in the same way, because if teachers think I'm too passionate, too aggressive, they don't respect me as much. They don't recommend me for opportunities. They don't grade my papers as well. So it automatically has this very real ramification on my future. So when you're talking to Black and brown students and you're like, well, just respect police, respect the school resource officers, and they won't ever do anything to you. And it's like, that's not how it works. I was often harassed by the school resource officers, and I was what was quote unquote a model student, a model citizen, a model whatever. And I had a good working relationship with the administration. And that was a very real privilege that saved me a lot of times when people misconstrued my passion for anger or for aggression or for violence. And a lot of students, they don't get that. They don't get that same privilege. And that is what is concerning, because then people go to write them off when they try to bring up these issues. And it's that we need to put credibility on youth voices. We need to tell teachers and administrators and all of these people who have very real impacts on students' lives that they need to be aware of this bias and they need to be aware of this adultification, because it can go on to affect a student's future very easily.
Oof. There's so much in that that's like so resonant, right? And there's so much. It makes me think of like we're trying to reimagine policing, and we need to be reimagining education as well,
Exactly.
right? like what we're talking about is like a system, like this structure to educate students that doesn't actually, like that's not the best way to educate students, right? Like you're not, like the best way to educate students is not necessarily in desks in rows with a PowerPoint and one person looking at you teaching, right? Like students have all different ways of being able to like learn and take in information, and this is not the best one, right? Number one, but also the structure. So one of the things that you were talking about, there was that whole part where you're talking about teachers making you feel smaller, right? Like the idea is that like Black people are taking up too much space in this room. You are having too much fun. I am uncomfortable with Black joy and Black pride, and that is not acceptable in this space. And I am going to do what I think is appropriate and like tell you that you were too loud or being too expressive, right? In ways in which we're going like, how are Black students like responsible for coddling the white fragility of their teachers, right? And like making sure that like they're not challenging white supremacy by their existence. And that is all in the structure that doesn't even need police to be there at all, right? Like there is going to be that self-policing regardless of whether cops are actually in the school or not. And like I know that I still, like I think until maybe 5 years ago, and I've been out of school for a minute, I was always like, I always had a lot of anxiety when I was somewhere like in a presentation or in a movie or something when people around me were talking, because like so I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, which is very white, like the driven snow. And I was the only Black person in like 6 out of 7 of my classes for my junior year. And that was only remarkable because of that seventh class. I was used to being the only one. And I remember that teachers, like people around me would be talking. I was not talking. And like they would always be like, Kia, you need to be quiet. It's time for like, we need to be paying attention. You need to be starting, right? Right. And like those were schools that didn't have police in them, right? But there's still that racism. There's still that straitjacket. There's still that like, you need to be towing the line, and you need to know that like we can knock you off of this at any point in time. And that's going to be totally fine, right? We don't need to have a reason. Like your Blackness is going to be enough, and you're not going to be treated fairly. Like there's going to be a separate set of rules for you. So again, even before you get to the point where you have to go to court, like you know that like you are having to self-police. And then on top of that, we are adding people who have guns and weapons into the space to go, oh, what, you decided that you were going to speak and that like you were going to be large enough to like actually present yourself, that you were going to argue with the teacher when they said some stupid racist stuff in class and tried to tell you that this was your education and like you knew better, and the teacher felt threatened. Well, that's not something that you get to do, so you're going to go to jail for that, right? You're going to get arrested in front of your peers. And I feel like there's so many videos that we've seen of like police officers like throwing Black and brown kids to the ground, right? Like we talk about like Black Lives Matter, and there's so many different ways in which we are out protesting for like the brutalization and like the death and the killing at the hands of police of like grown ass Black people. But they are doing this to our children. And I can't imagine how traumatic that it would be to have this person who everyone is telling you is there to protect you. And if you talk about how they're not there to protect you and they might be serving a different role, you are shut down, right? Because that means that you're part of the problem. And then they do the exact thing that you said that they were going to do. And then you're subjected to the exact same things. And there's the idea that like, this was your fault, right? So all of those different pieces are like different layers of trauma. And I feel like it's not just the policing in the schools or the police officers in the schools, it's all of the policing that goes up until that point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you know, Jemima, when you describe some of the scenes of your experience in school, and you talk about the dogs and the officers and the hallways, and what constantly comes to mind is just the image of a camp. And this idea of this transformation of the school into a camp. And, you know, we talked about the school to prison pipeline. Someone in the Q&A asked a question about the cradle to prison pipeline. And I'm just thinking about this, it's the world to prison pipeline but, you know, it seems like this pipeline just keeps getting shorter and shorter in some sense, where the school itself is really just being transformed into this camp prison-like environment. And I was wondering if that's something you might want to speak to a bit.
Yeah, I think I do very much have to acknowledge my privilege here in being able to go to a very wealthy school that was predominantly white. So the environment around me looked very nice. Like it wasn't as bad as some other schools in Austin that definitely have more of that like fortress like prison vibe. And I think one of the biggest things is that when we talk about like this adultification, it is very real in that not only are we expected to act like adults, is that we're seen as adults. And there's this very real kind of, when you talk about prison, I have this kind of idea in my head that talks about this power dynamic between the prisoners and between the prison guards. And it is very much the same way with students and school resource officers or police. It's that you have one group who is very specifically told, you have no power in this situation. And there is one group that is told, you have all of the power. And this group that has all of the power is constantly telling this powerless group, you need to respect me and I will respect you back. But there are two different definitions of respect at play there. One is respect as you must treat me as your superior. You must treat me almost like a god who has complete control over you. And then I will respect you by treating you as a human. And there's that dichotomy of that's not respect. Like there's a difference between respect and like basic human decency. And a lot of students aren't being given basic human decency and they aren't being met where they at as children. And I remember like one of the things that made this power dynamic very clear to me was throughout the entirety of my junior year, whenever my mom would drop me off at school, I had to walk through a very specific part of my school past like this kind of front desk where I know students know what I'm talking about, where like at every door, there's a front desk with like a woman who sits there and has a camera and like can buzz you in and out. But every day in the morning when I would walk past, there would always be a school resource officer there. And every day he would look at me, he would look me up and down, and he would be like, smile, darling, or smile, baby, or call me some sort of pet name. And one, I was like, sir, I am 15 years old. This is weird and inappropriate. But it also stresses to me every day. The first thing I hear when I walk into school is that you have power over me and I can't do anything about it. And when I express my discomfort or when I don't smile at him or when I don't acknowledge those advances, I am seen as mean or as unfriendly or as aggressive or as something that could get me in trouble or could get me hurt. Whereas we're not looking at this grown man and we're like, why are you speaking to a child in this manner? Why are you speaking to a student in their learning environment in this manner? And it's this power dynamic where students are constantly like, I feel powerless. And when you're a teenager, the one thing you want in your school, and the one thing you want in your life in general is to feel like you have some semblance of control over your identity, over where you're going in life, over the things you're experiencing and the things you're learning. But every day, students are walking into these buildings and told, you have no control over anything. And if you try to exert that control, if you try to exert that control over your identity, if you're not doing it in exactly the right way, then it's not correct. It's dangerous, it's violent. And it's the same thing that we see out on the streets with these Black Lives Matter protesters, is that they're constantly being told and policed on how to protest. It's like, if you're not sitting quietly at a lunch counter and you're not letting people throw things at you and harass you and scream vile things at you, then you're not protesting right. And it's often this like very whitewashed and very kind of cleansed version of the civil rights movement that we hear as well. It's that like Martin Luther King, he solely advocated for like peace and equality. And he was just like, everyone just sit down and like, we're just going to sit here and have a sit in and not say anything. And that's the form of protest that everyone wants. When that wasn't true, like that's just not the reality of really anything, of any social movement at any time in history. So it's like we have to step back from this tone policing and this identity policing and let students take control of their identities and let them be who they are and protest and speak up for themselves in the way they want. And it's that same thing of like, I mean, this is a whole other like can of worms, but it's like walking into school and me wearing my natural hair instead of wearing it straightened or in braids or in a way that is seemed as more white, so therefore more socially acceptable. Where if I wore an afro and boys would throw pencils at it or try to poke me or try to play with it, it's like I'm seen as this animal. But if I turn around and I yell at them to not touch me, then I'm aggressive. And I just need to chill out because it's a joke. And it's all of these things that build up where you're talking about layers of trauma. There are so many layers of trauma for Black girls and boys who are students in predominantly white high schools, but also just Black students and brown students and students who often have to deal with disabilities, whether they be cognitive or mental or physical, where they're trying to learn and they have to learn in different capacities in different ways. And they're often told, well, if you can't sit at a desk and you can't watch a lecture, then you're stupid. Or if you can't fill out this standardized test, then you're stupid and you're never going to go anywhere. When it's like, well, if we could do something that was mobile or more physical or have some sort of like sensory aspect where you could appeal to students where they're at. I mean, that's the biggest thing. You have to meet students where they are. And that's understanding the trauma that they go through in their everyday lives outside of school, understanding the differences in communities and socioeconomic statuses and poverty. All of these things that affects a student every day when they're trying to learn. So exactly, reimagining education so that it meets a student where they are, so we can effectively teach them instead of training them to be puppies who sit in a certain position and lay down when you want them to. That's not how kids work. And that's not how kids were ever meant to work.
I want to bring in some of the questions that people have had in chat. And I know that there's one that kind of speaks to the idea of parenting and discipline being left to teachers who are underpaid, frustrated, emotionally reactive, and ill-equipped. So it falls to the hands of an SRO. And I feel like there's a lot of complexity and nuance in there that I'd love for you all to speak to about what that looks like.
I mean, I think one solution, I mean, we can't solve structural racism today because that's at the root of all of this. And I think that's going to take us a little longer to dismantle. But when we talk about teachers who are underpaid and the responsibility going to resource officers, there's a solution. The $10 to $15 million that's going to police officers in our districts can go to paying our teachers more and having social workers and counselors in our school buildings.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's when we're talking about policing, like that is, in general, we live in a capitalistic society. Our society runs on money. And where we put our money is where we put our morals and where we put our values. And right now, it's not with teachers. And I always try when I'm speaking about things, my heart goes out to teachers every single day because they have it rough. And I never want to blame them for, I mean, of course, there are always cases where it's just like, dude, you shouldn't have done that. But in majority of cases, so many times it's that teachers are underworked. The expectations for them are through the roof without meeting any of their needs, not their resource needs, not their structural needs, all of these things. When it's like, when we're talking about police, it's this massive organization that we've just been funneling money into for decades. When it's like, where does it go? What is it used for? It's used for the further criminalization and harm to Black and brown and disabled students. And when those are the same students that end up in prison or end up in court and having to deal with these traumatic experiences, and when we look back, we're like, what could we have done to change this? It's like, pay your teachers, pay for resources and for programs that don't begin in court, that don't have anything to do with the juvenile justice system. I think one of the biggest things that I researched during my time at TCJC was something called restorative justice, which is kind of a disciplinary practice that goes completely against zero tolerance, in that zero tolerance just kind of is like, well, if we just give everyone the same blanket disciplinary punishment, then our teachers won't have to work as hard. It'll take something off their plate, and that'll ensure true quote unquote equality. When in reality, it's just being used to over police more than they already are Black and brown and disabled students. When we've seen that restorative justice more aims to isolate the behavior rather than the student. And it's to understand that root cause where, I mean, everything is kind of a symptom of structural racism, but trying to understand the causes that cause a student to quote unquote act out and causes a student to be troubled and things like that. So it's like, why is a student constantly late? Well, their parent might not have access to proper transportation. If you go to a private school, why aren't you wearing your uniform? Because uniforms are expensive. There are things like that that is clearly not the student's fault, but we're still over punishing our students for things like that. And we found that with teachers, it is this cultural shift that allows for them to treat their students more like human beings in a sense where they're not constantly pushed into that role of parent and mediator and counselor and all of these things that they're not meant to be, and it allows them more room to teach. And that's the same thing that is such an issue with SROs right now, is that we're constantly requiring them to be coaches and to be counselors and to be teachers and to be all of those things that they have absolutely no training to do. Teachers have degrees upon degrees, and they have thousands and thousands of student loans for a reason. They went to school for this. They know what they're doing. But SROs walk in after a couple of months of training and they're like, let me do your job. Sir, that's not how this works, unfortunately, but it is how it's been working. So it's like, we need to give our teachers the proper resources, and that comes from that top-down commitment. People in Senate, people in the House of Representatives, all the way down to our principals and our superintendents and our administrators need to give us that commitment. They need to say, I'm going to fight for those resources. And they need to back us up when we say, all this money doesn't need to be going to police, when there's clearly this screaming and reaching out need in our schools from our students and our teachers saying, we don't have all of the things we need. And it's like, why are police out there in armored vehicles and riot gears when our schools have water leaking through our ceilings and textbooks that are from like the 60s? It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense in my mind.
I feel like those are beautiful answers. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the other half of that question, where the idea is that the issues are on the lack of parenting, or that like parenting or parents don't have appropriate discipline for their kids, and speak to, because there's definitely people who have those concerns, right? And we know that there's different perceptions around that, right? And like, who are we seeing as the kids that need discipline anyway? But can you speak to that idea of like, oh, well, the parents had a lack of discipline, or that should be on them?
For me, I have a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old. So it always bothers me when I hear that piece, because I don't know. I've served lots of families in lots of different circumstances with very limited resources. And not one parent says in the morning, all right, let me tell you what I want from you. I want you to get up to that school and I want you to act a fool. I want you to do whatever you need to do to cut up and get yourself right back to this house. That doesn't happen. Parents that I talk to always want the best for their children, but they themselves may not have had the education that they need to help them understand how to navigate the school system. Because again, we're talking about structural racism. And so if you have spent hundreds of years of denying people the right and the access to education, education should be the practice of freedom. But if you deny them the education, they don't have the same kind of freedom, and they don't have the resources to provide the things that middle class and upper middle class families can provide. And so I think that we need to support parents, not like if that parent was doing a better job, not parent shame, but actually help parents, help them figure out how to garner all of the resources that they need, help them learn how to navigate the school system in productive ways for their children. support them. I say all the time that we are always looking for volunteers to fill in the gap for parents, to support them, to help them, because I'm very, very privileged. I recognize that. And I recognize that I have very privileged children, but it was not easy. I still have Black kids in school. And so even with all of the privilege, every day I was talking to my son. Praise God, he is off at college, sophomore in college. Praise God, he went to an HBCU so he could have a different experience. But every day I was like, okay, when you go to school, this has to happen. Now, blah, 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 and this. And I mean, like, there was a whole like parameter that he had to work within, because I'm like, you will not go to prison. And when parents are so worried about their children going to prison, or their children being slammed to the ground, or their children eating, or their children having a place to live, like, come on, y'all. Like, that's a lot to manage for any parent. And then you throw in a school that doesn't care about your children. And I'm not talking about this aesthetic care, this, throwing up posters all over the place about no place for hate and all that madness. I'm talking about authentic care. You care about the well-being of that child. So you're trying to get to know that child. You're trying to get to know that family. You are trying to say, okay, I can connect this person to the counselor, and we have a counselor in our school building who can provide this resource, and this resource. We can't do that because we're paying police officers. Like, there are mechanisms that we can put in place to support families. Yeah. And we're not doing that. We're not supporting families. We're not supporting teachers. We're not supporting children. And so I as a parent that has struggled to get a Black boy out of the public school system, K through 12, who is now doing the same thing with a Black girl, because while the circumstances are different in how they're treated in school, they're still Black, because how they treat my daughter as if she's 20. Like, yeah. What in the world? She's 13. Like, I want us to stop blaming parents. I want us to put the blame where the blame should be. And the blame should be on structural racism and how do we provide access and opportunity? How do we provide that access and support to parents? Because when they know better, they do better, just like everybody else.
Yeah. Yes, I have to emphasize everything Dr. Robertson just said, because this society is not easy on parents. Like, it really isn't. And speaking from a child's perspective, I'm the daughter of 2 immigrants. I have an older brother. My dad is from Africa. My mom is British. Like, I remember growing up, my parents were hustlers. Like, they were working so hard to give me the absolute best. Like, my mom went on and got a PhD. My dad, I have never seen that man take a solid break from work in his entire life. And I sometimes don't know how he's still alive and like running at the speed he is. But when we talk about parents, you have to understand, we don't make it easy for parents to let their kids succeed. We don't make it easy. We don't give those parents the resources to help their children flourish to the fullest extent, because they're so focused on just making sure that they have the basic necessities in life. Like, I remember when I was 9, we made the move from New Jersey to Texas. And that was really, really hard on me, because we went from a very diverse community to a kind of fully white, very wealthy, like very classically Texan community that I had never experienced before. And here I am, a 9-year-old Black girl in a private Christian school in an experience that I was not prepared for. And I made it hard on my parents, because I was acting out, because there were so many factors going in. I was experiencing racism for the very first time. And I know every Black person has those memories in their head of when they first became aware of how differently the world treats them. I was experiencing I'm not going to drop the name of my middle school because I don't want those parents to come after me, but I was experiencing like the weaponizing of religion for the first time. I was experiencing the shaming of wearing a skirt to school and being in a uniform and having my skirt measured. Like there were so many things going on that the school system was pushing on me, but also being in a new environment was pushing on me, that when I came home, I didn't want to help out my parents. I didn't want to make life easy for them. That wasn't my thought. And they were doing everything in their power to support me. And on top of that, I had 2 undiagnosed learning disabilities at the same time. And there I was like flunking out of math because I have something called dyscalculia, which is basically like math dyslexia. And everyone was like, she's just not focusing. She's just not working hard enough. And my parents were like, we're getting her all of the tutors. We're sitting down. We're running flashcards with her. And my school was constantly like, well, why aren't you working harder with her? Why aren't you sending her to school with the mindset of like, she can do this? And it's like, so often we're putting the blame in the wrong places. It's not the teacher's fault. It's not the parents' fault. It's the structure's fault. It's structural racism. It's capitalism and greed. It is all of these things that are contributing to a society that is harsh and hard. And every day when my parents came home exhausted from work or trying to find a job, it was like my school then expected them to go to like the 110% effort with me. When I had an older brother, and then even when our kids do succeed, like my brother is now, he goes to the University of Pennsylvania. He's a smart guy. He has that Ivy League education. He's going hard. But at the same time, my parents then have to push even harder because even though he's quote unquote a success, you still have to pay for that success. Ivy League educations, they're not cheap. College in itself is not cheap. And there's all of these factors that just pile onto each other when it's in reality, if we kind of took some of that stress and funneled some more resources into our families and into that support, then we wouldn't have to feel like we need someone to blame. Like when you feel like you need someone to blame and you end up blaming the people who are really the victims of the issue, that's when you know the system's working the way that it was intended. Because now you're not looking at it and you're not saying, well, what education reform can we use? Like, how can we give our students more mental health services? How can we get girls diagnosed for learning disabilities at a younger age? Why do we only see ADHD in boys and not girls? Things like that, where it's like, those are very structural issues. Whereas it's not my parents' fault that my mind doesn't process numbers correctly. And it's not their fault that they didn't see that till I was in 8th grade. There are all of these things where the system just keeps failing over and over again. And people are coming and saying, well, parents, why aren't you doing better? And it's like, I'm doing my best. Like, my parents did a great job. They're still doing a great job. But so often my school was like, why aren't you doing a better job? And it's like, because we're trying to pay a mortgage and we're paying for this tutor. And my dad is working 12-hour days. And my mom is trying to find a new career for herself and also trying to get an education. And it's all of these things where it's like, you want people to live this American dream, but the American dream is unattainable because we've made it unattainable. You can't pay for the American dream. You can't pay for the education to get the American dream. And it's like, when you blame parents and when you blame teachers, it feels logical because that's what we've been told. It's like in American society, we're very individualistic. So it's like, why isn't it on the person to do better? But in reality, it's like, if we all just kind of fix the system just a little bit, at this point, just a little bit would be great. If we fix the system just that little bit and we kept pushing for more and pushing for more, then you kind of lift this weight off of the individual. And then the individual, you can't blame them because I really believe in everyone supporting each other and in community. And I know that we are at our strongest when we believe in community. So it's like, instead of trying to blame the symptom, blame the issue, blame the root cause. And if parents are quote unquote not doing enough, that is very much a symptom of a very harsh and very punitive society.
I feel like y'all are just full of all of the wisdom and I want to bask in it. Like, I feel like everybody just wants to bask in it.
It's Jemima. I'm just trying to learn.
No, I think that like when we're talking about like structural racism, which you brought up initially, Dr. Robinson, that like what is the structural racism in determining like whose child is acting up and whose isn't, right? Like how is it that our schools and our teachers are often perceiving our trauma responses as acting up or acting out, or as disruptive and as bad kids, when like these are trauma responses that are absolutely created by the environment that we're in, right? If we didn't have to, like you, Dr. Robinson, you started talking about how like the things that you started this conversation with around like your own trauma with your family, and like what is it like to have to know that your parent is incarcerated at a young age, and what is the trauma that is there, right? What are the trauma responses that we get to have that are appropriate, right? When like this is happening to us in the classroom, while at the same time we're still dealing with like racism from kids, because kids don't hold back, right? Like we're still dealing with racism from teachers, because teachers don't even understand, have a basic understanding of what racism is and what microaggressions are and what internalized racial oppression is, or the manifestations thereof, right? What are we talking like? And then you're also dealing with like the traumas of like of being female and like male dominated space, right? Like just what are all of these different traumas that are layered on top of each other, and like how is it that when we have a trauma response, it's then considered to be like something that needs to be punished, right? Instead of like analyzing the systems and figuring out where that trauma is coming from, like that girl who finally punched somebody, right? Are we considering that girl who punched somebody to be like, oh well, they were acting out, like that was a bad child? Well, yeah, if you have like this ahistorical context, it's just taking that out of the context of everything else. But like, why are we not talking about like the behavior of all of these other kids who were racist towards this person, and like how the system of that school system perpetuated harm in allowing that to happen, right? Whether it's the parents or the students or the teachers or all of the people who were involved there were apparently fine with that behavior, but not with the reaction to it. And so I think that that's really important when we're going like, okay, well, we're going to blame the parents. Blame the parents for what? Like, what is the lens that we're looking at in order to see what the problem is in the first place, right? Not to mention the fact that if you've got Black and brown parents, that they also had to go through this school system, and that trauma hasn't shaken out yet, because let me tell you, that takes decades, right? And that's if you have privilege and a therapist and money and the ability to say like, no thank you, I'm just going to stay home today, right? With many of us do not, right? On top of the fact that like these are students who are now having to deal with the racism that you're talking about, and these school resource officers that are inappropriate being like, smile baby, like what is that? Grown ass women are not okay with that, right? Like if that happened in my workplace, that's called sexual harassment and you get fired. Or more likely, I also get reprimanded because like, you know, find people on both sides. But like we have a structural framework for that, but like these kids are having to deal with that on top of the same stress that we all have as adults, being in a pandemic that is being completely mismanaged, right? Being in the time of the largest global conversation around police brutality, where police are bringing extra police brutality to the police brutality march, right? And seeing these like conversations in real time and understanding that like the fabric of our society is unraveling, and y'all are like, well, you acting out, right? Like that's the least that we can do. That is the absolute least that we can do when a society is like ripping apart from the fabric. Like if you've got enough time to focus on me acting out, then that means that you have resources to fix this, and maybe you should do that, and I'll be able to chill out over here and be nice and calm for you, right? So I feel like those are some of the things that are coming up for me after listening to some of the things that y'all have said. GP, it is now 7:06. Do we want to take a look at some of the questions that people have been asking?
I think it would be a great time to invite some people to join us maybe and share their thoughts.
Yeah, so Jemima, Dr. Robinson, are you all able to see the questions in the question and answer section? Do y'all have that?
So Some are in the Q&A box, and some are just in the general chat. Sometimes people leave their thoughts in the general chat. If you see anything that you'd particularly like to address, we will invite the participants to come on and join us.
Yeah.
So let me take a look here. We also have one attendee with a hand raised, Leah Leon. Leah, have you posted a question? Post a question for us, and then we'll invite you to come in and join us and share.
Leah posted the question in chat about the parent. Wait, no, that was.
Yeah, that was the one about.
Is that Leah? Yeah, the one about parents having ill or truant conduct for their children and the lack of parenting. So I feel like we answered that one.
Okay. I think we have Christelle as well here, who had a question about Christelle had posted a question about how to convince parents who are scared of school shootings that they will not make their children safer.
I think we have to have real conversations with parents. One, about who the school shooters are and who's bringing weapons to school, but who's being policed. I think we need to talk to them about the real numbers around school shootings. It's scary. I mean, as a parent, it's super scary, but it's also super scary to know that your school resource officer may not help at all, like during a school shooting. Like, we haven't had one case where the police officer inside the school was the one who like made everything all better. It's the police that are coming from the outside into the school that have solved the problem. And I just think that parents need to understand that. I think personally, the kid who brings the weapon to school with the intent on shooting up his classmates needs the services that we're talking about, needs the social workers and the counselors and the support services and teachers that aren't so spent that they're paying attention to what's happening to this child in their classrooms, what that child is feeling and thinking. You know,
Christelle, do you want to?
Yeah. Yeah, this is really hard. So I've been working with Undoing Racism Round Rock, and they have been working very, very hard on trying to get their school district not to have an internal police department. Their equity office did an amazing job, put together a huge presentation, just so professionally and well done. And then there was an incident in one of the elementary schools where there was a threat. Somebody brought a gun or threatened that they were bringing a gun or something. And the parents that showed up at that school board meeting and wanted an internal police department. And it didn't matter. All of the facts were presented. All of the numbers were presented. Everything was presented to those parents in terms of what actually makes children safer, how it falls on the Black and brown students. But I'm telling you, those Indian parents, they were so afraid of school shootings. And now Round Rock is getting an internal police department. And it's just
police chief.
It's just so disappointing to see that there was that possibility. And everything was done right. And still, it's just, yeah. So I don't know, maybe this is about community organizing and trying to get the parents that really are coming into this really not understanding any of it. And they, they're just so afraid of this one-time situation, but it's likely that it would be Parkland, right? Where the SRO wasn't there and didn't want to go into that situation anyway. They just don't understand. And I don't know how you have that conversation. I don't know how that happens.
I wanted to just flag that this is really kind of a recurring theme in all of our conversations around these different areas, is how, because we haven't really done the work of imagining what safety can look like without policing, we keep coming back to policing as the way to address safety and this idea, this very paradigmatic idea that police somehow prevent crime, which or prevent violence, which there's just no substantive data to prove that. But Dr. Robinson earlier mentioned education as a practice of freedom, which of course makes me think immediately of Paulo Freire from Brazil. And one of his famous lines was, if education isn't liberatory, then the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor, right? And so I feel like there is this sense in which, if we've been raised and trained in a paradigm of policing as safety, and then we think, well, I want to provide the best safety for my children, then we come back to this place. So I think I just wanted to highlight that.
I was thinking something similar, like there's also this idea of like denial of racism and proximity to whiteness, right? And this idea that like where our trauma response is going to be fawning, right? And be like, no, we love the police, right? And trying to kind of level up and upgrade that idea. And I think that what you're talking about is hold hands with that idea. And I feel like the community organizing part is like getting people to understand the framework of like what their responses are, both what their trauma responses are and what their internalized racial oppression responses are, so that we are able to hold them like accountable as community and all get on the same page.
Yeah. Because it's like the air that we breathe. Like no one is like immune to it. Like we all are sort of breathing in white supremacy every single day. It's not like any of us can escape it. Because that's why in our schools, we sometimes see our Black and brown teachers treat our Black and brown children in ways that mimic white supremacy. It's how we're taught and how we're trained, and unraveling that and building a critical consciousness among our community members isn't going to just happen overnight. So I really appreciated the thought around community organizing, because I think that's what it's going to take. And a couple of people mentioned the phrase I used, education as the practice of freedom. That's Bell Hooks' work, if you are interested in reading her stuff. And I think that goes along with this whole thinking about how do we organize community to really educate each other about what the real sort of concerns and issues are, so that we can all be free. Because if the most marginalized of us get supported and find freedom, then we're all free. And we have a long way to go.
Yeah. I think when thinking about this question specifically, it's hard because fear and love coupled together is the strongest motivator in the world. And a lot of times we see that come to fruition in a parent's fear for their child's safety because they can't imagine losing a child. Like that is the worst pain possibly imagined. But at the same time, when we're talking about the issue of school shooting, it's almost like there's three parts. One, it is very much a symptom of a larger issue. And a lot of that is access to mental health resources, structural racism, the way just our education works in general. But there's also this very practical issue of just students' access to guns as well. And I think in talking about that, you also have to talk about the unwillingness for people in power and for people who have especially political power, who are so unwilling to give up any sort of what they believe is freedom / liberation in their minds for other people. And then that is that larger issue of, well, we refuse, especially in Texas, like this is the land of guns and everything is bigger in Texas and don't take my guns and things like that. So it's like this unwillingness to take a step and maybe leave something behind, because in leaving that behind, you're losing something. So of course that can't be freedom, that can't be equity, that can't be equality or liberation, because if I have to lose something, if I have to give up part of that privilege, then isn't that just the same sort of oppression? When in reality, it's, when you're thinking about school shootings as an issue, there is that practical step that needs to be taken of implementing solid and reasonable gun control. But there's also that larger step that just needs to be taken with education in general, of the fact of resources, that resources and the system of education and the way we are educating our children in America today does not work. It is not, one, sustainable for mental health, and it's not sustainable for safety in general. And I think that brings it back to this entire idea of, why is having safe schools and having safe students completely separate? Like, one, it is a large debate on whether or not our schools are actually safe. I would venture out to say no, just because of the frequency that we see with school shootings, and how March in 2020 was the first month we had seen in years without a single school shooting. And that was solely because there was a global pandemic and not a single school was open for that to be a possibility. And that, one, is baffling. But two, taking that step and then understanding that the larger system of education needs so much work and so much reform. And then that brings in the topic of what needs to be abolished and what can handle reform. Because in my view, and very much in my framework, like, police as a system and prisons as a system, it's time for abolition. And it's not only because of where they come from. It's not just because they're rooted in intense racism, because so many things in our country, basically everything in our country, comes from racism and comes off of the back of Black and brown people and of immigrants and of slaves. We know this, like that, yes. But there are some systems that I would debate that can be reformed. However, police and prisons as a system is just inhumane, and it doesn't work. And when you say, oh, but we're just sending this person to prison for rehabilitation, where, when, how? No. Like, we all know that that's not how it works. And when you look at police as a system and kind of the ramifications of their work and their actions in our communities, how does that promote safety? How does that promote anything other than racialized brutality and harm? And a lot of people are like, well, but if we just reform them, if we just take away their money and like defund them, then it's like, well, you just have an angry like system of people who still have access to weapons and means of brutality that now are resentful because you haven't really changed anything. You've just made it less expensive to enact racialized brutality. So, not to say defunding the police is not a great first step, but we can't stop there. We can't keep going halfway. You have to take that full step of, okay, we're defunding on the route to abolition, to replace it with a system that focuses on communities, that focuses on kind of rehabilitation and true safety, safety in expression, safety in identity, safety in mental health, safety in who we are as people that includes all people, not just the people who are in power and remain in power since America's establishment. So I think when you talk, it's hard to boil this issue down to specific things like school shootings, because so many of these instances of violence are symptoms of such a large issue that you have to talk about it all in tandem. But at the same time, there are also those practical steps that need to be taken right now, because like Dr. Robbins had said, you can't solve structural racism today. Like, that's hard. I wish. Oh, trust me, like, I wish. But you can't. But you can implement common sense gun control. You can take away some of those weapons that are being used to enact some of this violence, but you also just can't stop there.
We want to invite one more attendee to join us, maybe. Is there a question here that y'all think we should maybe talk about? think, Angela, are you still here with us?
Angela Pierce?
Yeah.
Let's take a look.
Edis. Angela, if you are here and you want to join us, well, you're on. I'm not sure.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No, my daughter used to go to a school, elementary school, where we have seen police being called on kids sometimes, that you would get there and police car would be there. What I heard, because I never went too deep into that, was that when there's a problem with a kid who is in foster care system, and that school receive a lot of kids in the foster care from the foster care system, that they had to call the police. For me, it's hard to believe that. And so my question is, like, what is at the discretion at administrations when to call the police or not, and whether there's any accountability or any control over when police is called, like that does the district has any oversight on independent schools when they decide to call the police, and why, and is that data available?
The data is available. Principals, administrators have complete discretion on when the police are called, complete discretion. As I mentioned earlier, even in what we consider mandated referrals like weapons or drugs, it is still the discretion of the administrator whether the police are called or not. Do we have an accountability system? Well, sort of, but not really. Some schools report some things, some districts report other things. Most of them don't really report the amount of use of force that happens in the schools. So the data is shaky, as I can't find an academic word right now to say, other than shaky. So there is some data, and I've said for a long time that I would love to have community members who serve on a board that are accountability partners for their particular school or their school district. Because I think schools need community accountability, because you can't ask the schools and the school districts to account for themselves. Like that doesn't really work.
I think that is one of the largest failings on behalf of schools right now, is that they don't have, one, the resources or kind of the encouragement to report that data. I know at TCJC, a lot of what we focus on is kind of writing reports and looking for that data to back up the policy and the legislation that we kind of propose, that's the word I'm looking for, during the Texas legislative session. But a lot of it, especially when it comes to kids and students and in schools, is really hard to find, because there's not a centralized place where we are gathering all this data and being able to say, this is what use of force looks like. This is the actual number of kind of assaults and referrals and suspensions and expulsions that happens in a school. And these are the demographics of that. And I think that is one of the biggest things that I can say to community members, is that listen to your students. If they come home that day and they say, I saw an SRO take another student and slam them against a wall or something like that, students are really the only ones who are seeing all of this go down. And there's kind of no place for them to put that. There's no one to tell, basically. So I think the biggest thing we can do as community members is take that upon ourselves to kind of hold our schools accountable. And if a student comes home and says, I got ripped out of my desk or shoved on the ground and pinned by a school resource officer, support that family, support those parents, support that student. Don't immediately say, well, did you antagonize them? What was the issue? Like, what did you do? There's that kind of balance of victim blaming where there are so many larger structural and systematic issues that a lot of times, a lot of these students were just being students and we're just being kids. And we have to be very cognizant of the way that we push maturity and push adultification on kids of color and on Black kids, that we can't say, oh, but because you were being loud, you deserved that sort of aggression and that sort of violence. And it's us pushing for that accountability and pushing for those creations of spaces where we can put that data, because it is so sorely needed. I know there are so many times when all we could do was ask a principal or ask the superintendent, hey, do you know how often this is happening in your district? And oftentimes the answer is no. And we really need that data, because without it, a lot of people are like, oh, but that's just your opinion. And it's like, well, yeah, right now it is really just conjecture, because no one's giving anybody access to that data and no one's compiling it anywhere. So I know for a fact that what we're saying is true. And I know that the little data we have does back up these kind of conversations that need to happen with SROs and with police. But at the same time, there is sorely a need for that compilation of data and for a place for all of that to go.
And you know, Jemima, that also makes me think about how selective the narrative about violence is in terms of our concern about violence. So, you know, you have groups of parents who come and they're concerned about the violence in the schools, and it's a certain kind of violence. And then that violence justifies the presence of police officers. But what about this other violence that's being suffered by students, you know? And what about these other parents who are concerned about their students suffering violence? And we very sort of selectively ignore certain kinds of violence if they're coming from if it's coming from SROs, or if it's coming from, you know, I think that's very interesting. And we ignore the way that other kind of violence perpetuates and produces the other violence. And it's all very much connected.
Yeah, definitely. I think the main thing that I want to say every time I'm in one of these spaces, or every time that I am given a platform, is put credibility on youth voices. Listen to us when we say something is wrong. Listen to us when we say, I need this, or I'm feeling this. Don't just say, oh, you're a teenager, you're over emotional, or you don't have enough experience in the world. Cool. I only have 17 years of experience on this planet. But at the same time, my lived experience is important. And I wish so often that youth didn't feel like they constantly needed permission, or they constantly needed to be invited into these spaces. Because the number one thing I know is that if you take your space and if you say it with enough conviction and enough confidence, somebody will listen. And that is the only time that we're gonna get change in our schools. Because who's there every day and who's not on a payroll? Students. We have so much to lose for speaking up, but if we weren't constantly being threatened by losing so much, the world has so much to gain by listening to us. And I'm so thankful that I had people like the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and like Lindsay Linder and Alicia Castillo, who is watching and has been incredibly supportive throughout this entire thing for me, who I had people like them. I was really lucky and really privileged to have those people who said, speak up, say it louder, we want to hear you. But so many voices, especially those who are less privileged than I, don't have that support and don't have those people saying, it's okay. If you get flack for saying this, we'll back you up. If you need a school note to come speak at this conference, we'll write it. They don't have that. And so often people are like, why don't youth get involved? Why are you so apathetic? Why are they the lowest voting pool? And it's like, we make it so hard for them to speak up, and we make it's such high stakes where if they say the wrong thing, or they step in the wrong manner, or something's too aggressive, too violent, too political, too out there, then they lose everything. Where youth are the only ones who know what happened in school every day, because they are there, they are on no one's payroll, and they have to be there 8 hours a day for so many weeks out of the full year. So listen to them, put the credibility on their voices.
Hard, yes. Hard, agree. And I think that we should go even further and have students be the one that we're taking direction from when we're talking about every single part of schooling. We're talking about every single part of education, from like how we are sitting in our classes and moving around the building, to what the curriculum is, to what are the processes for punishment and engagement, right? Like, not just listen to them, but like allow them to lead this process. The idea of like nothing about us without us is something that can be and must be realized in education, in order for us to be able to reimagine education. And like the only reimagining of education has to happen in a way that is led by student voices and the people who are closest to the issues in those schools. So hard agree, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And someone said in the chat, how do we encourage students to speak out? And the biggest thing I say is trust them. Put value in them, make them feel like they're heard. I know so often when kids go to their parents, and not to blame the parents, it's just how the world tells adults to treat children. And when they speak about an issue they see, it's like, oh, well, but it's so much worse in the adult world. One, ouch, like scary. But then two, it's like, yeah, but this is my first time experiencing this. And also, everything is new and fresh. And I still have so much excitement about the world. Take our excitement and use it for the better. Let us speak about what we're seeing. Put trust and put value in the things that we're saying. And also, when someone is trying to kind of come after us for saying something quote unquote out of line, or trying to speak up against something that we're seeing that we're not supposed to be speaking up about, but that needs to be said, don't let that happen. Don't let youth lose everything because they're the disposable ones. Don't treat youth as disposable. In conclusion, basically, tell us that we're valued. Tell us that you trust what we're saying. Tell us that you want to hear it, basically. I know that so many kids around me would speak up if they felt like people wanted to hear what they had to say. So the tools are very simple and very powerful at the same time.
And listen to the kids that are saying things that you don't want to hear, right? Don't just pick the ones that sound like the principal anyway, or able to parrot the ideas that you think are really good. You need to be listening to the children who are saying things that make you uncomfortable, because that is your growing edge. And those are the kids that are going to give you the best experience, because like they are pushing you past what you are comfortable with.
Yeah.
Dr. Robinson, do you have closing thoughts that you want to share with us?
There's this saying that Mandela used to say, that there's no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children. So I just want to ask everybody, one person can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And so figure out what your something is, and organize and plot and plan and conspire to change the future for our children.
Yeah.
JP?
That was incredibly powerful. I do not want to follow that. I do want to say, and this is in some sense a subject that, we've kind of touched on at various times, and it's also probably a subject for other conversations, but I want to highlight that we have to be very careful with narratives, with bootstraps narratives, narratives of rugged individualism, of self-help, and the ways in which those are used to shut down important conversations like the one we're having right now about, policing in schools and about structural racism in schools. And I just want to say that, we have to think about this, in communities of practice, groups of parents. Think about the ways in which the narrative that you just have to go out and do for self and work harder and try harder and push your student harder is used to silence and shut down this kind of real experience that Jemima has described, that Dr. Robinson has highlighted for us. And so, I think my closing thought is, beware of the ways in which narratives of this kind of bootstraps individualism and this kind of atomized individualism allow us to circumvent this kind of structural violence that we're perpetuating, and find ways to have a narrative that is a narrative of community, of collective struggle, of collective growth and collective power. So those are my closing thoughts.
Beautiful. I feel like we are ending with this idea of collective power, and I feel like the idea of youth understanding their own power, getting a sense of their own power and what that looks like in collective, would be really terrifying for a lot of adults and principals and folks who are really insistent on keeping order. And if we had that, if we were fostering that kind of growth, can you imagine what our society would look like and how that would be different, right? When we left the school system. And I think that there's so much possibility, and we've talked about organizing and connecting several times in this. And I think that that is a large part of the answer to this. How are we organizing to reimagine what education looks like? How are we organizing with those parents in Round Rock who are confused about like how police are going to come into the system and like brutalize their children as well, right? Like, how are we organizing the youth so that like when they're not invited to the table, that they make their own table and they're like, no, this is what we're going to do right now, right? How are we giving them the keys to so that they can get a sense of their own power and take us to places that we haven't even imagined yet, right? Like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about like the brilliance of these kids, and them being able to look at how not to do things, and be able to have a foundation of like, this is what has hurt me, and so I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And like, what is the reimagining that we are going to be able to have with a human-centered lens on education? Just so brilliant. Thank you both so much for coming and sharing your brilliance and wisdom with us. I feel like there's a lot of folks in the chat who still have questions and thoughts. Is there a way that they can connect with you after this?
Absolutely. I can share my website and email in the chat for folks.
So good.
Yeah,
I think the best way, I'll put it in the chat also, to reach me is over social media. I think if you want some great, robust learning for a little bit of plug is just go to the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition's website. They have a lot of great resources. They're really great at centering youth voices. If you want more hard facts and statistics, that's not my specialty, but it's definitely some of my coworkers' specialties. So definitely go for that. And I'll put my email in there too. I'm always open for a discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Thank you everybody who hung in there with us. Y'all are getting lots of accolades in the chat. I think that people were really appreciative of the discussion that y'all brought. JP, you want to close us out?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It was just an honor partaking in your wisdom, your experience, and I hope that we can continue to struggle towards this different world.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.